And as I understand, you published your book recently, right? It's called When We Touch. I think it has two names, right? But the European name is When We Touch. And I believe it's based on, and as I know, it's based on this big research project based on 113 countries, right?
Yeah,
study case.
That's right. Yeah, so it's
And you'll talk a bit more about it one second, but in the description of this book, it says that the book basically represents an exploration of the new science behind our most underappreciated sense and why we need to harness the power of touch for our health and well-being. So now I have like several questions, actually. One question, or maybe just if you could share a bit more about this book, what it is about, briefly, and then the other two questions are related to these words underappreciated. So basically, why touch is underappreciated, and then why do we need to harness it? Why do we need to partner with that? And you also mentioned previously that when you started your research in touch, you realized there's so much in vision and also audio modalities, right? But not much about touch. Why?
Yeah, I think it's so I guess to answer the first part of the question to begin with. So
sorry,
the book
too many
is,
questions.
yeah, so the book, as you say, it's called When We Touch. In North America, it's also called Touch Matters. So in North America, it has a different title to the rest of the world. But When We Touch is the original title, I guess, of the book. It's very much all about, I suppose, touch in everyday life, those everyday situations where we use touch, and why it's important and the implications touch can have on things like our health, our well-being, even down to something as simple as how we might buy products in a supermarket, or we might be convinced if a robot touches us to agree to a request. So it's a really broad, wide-ranging book. It kind of covers touch and health, touch and well-being, touch in our relationships, but also touch in society, and how more and more we might see some of these digital forms of touch coming in, and how that might play out in different settings, whether that's a care home, in a supermarket, etc. And like you say, it really stemmed on the back of a very large study that we did early in 2020, which involved around 40,000 people worldwide. It was called the Touch Test. We did this with the British Broadcast Corporation in the UK, the BBC. And in that, we asked many questions about the meaning of touch in the world today. And of course, we launched that in January 2020 without any knowledge what was around the corner, which was, of course, was COVID and pandemic-related restrictions.
So timely, isn't it?
So it became, it became incredibly timely. Although actually, to be honest, one media source called it the most ill-timed study ever carried out. so that's the other way to look at it. But I did think it was timely, actually, and
I think
and
so,
it was. And actually, I think COVID was part of the reason why I somewhat came to talk somewhat about touch as one of our most underappreciated senses, because I think for a lot of us, it wasn't until touch was taken away from us during the pandemic and some of those pandemic restrictions. And by that, I mean things like not being able to touch products or touch things when you're out on the streets, or being, at least in the UK, we had lockdowns, national lockdowns, where you couldn't see your friends and you couldn't engage in, I don't know, a hug with a family member. There were all these things that were taken away. And I think in those moments, a lot of us began to realize, well, actually, I'm really missing something crucial in my life here. And I think it drew that awareness, because touch is the kind of sense that it's with us all the time. I mean, even talking to you right now, right? I'm sitting here on my chair, my feet are pressing on the floor. I'm getting all sorts of tactile feedback that I'm not even thinking about. But it's so important to ground me in the moment. It's so important for, if you and I were to meet and we were to, I don't know, shake hands before we meet, it has a huge impact on how much we're likely to listen to each other, how much we're likely to build a sense of trust and connection between each other. If someone gives you a hug, I don't know, unless you're getting supportive hugs in your life, it's been shown that the greater frequency of hugging that people can have can sometimes protect them from things like stressful events, or it can protect them from the likelihood of developing virus symptoms and stuff like this. So there's a lot of ways that touch has these hidden impacts on us. And for me, that's why I somewhat call it an underappreciated sense, because I don't think we often stop and think about touch in that way. Like, we might think that a hug feels nice. We might think somebody giving us a hug feels good, but how often do we stop and think, well, what are the impacts of that on my physical and mental health? And the answer is they're pretty powerful, actually. They're pretty important. And so this is, to me, where it kicks in. And I suppose, and like I said at the very start, in terms of a research sense, I think our awareness of this is quite new. I think a lot of the work on touch over the years has focused on what we call the discriminative aspects of touch. So your ability to make fine discriminations between an object, feel those differences. It hasn't really been until, probably the past 30 odd years or so that people have started to really dig into that, I suppose, more emotional side of touch, right? That why does a pleasant touch feel good?
Do you have any idea? Yeah, do you have any idea why this happened? Why is so underappreciated by the community in a sense of research or even investment, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to unpack that, I think. I think investment and funding, there's many factors that play a role in that, in terms of where priorities are at a given time. And I think, I think vision often has dominated in sensory research, and I think that is because vision is such a dominant sense that we as people tend to use.
By the way, for only those who have vision, right? So that's
exactly. Yeah, no, for those where it's available, it becomes a dominant sense in that way. And I think vision's also been particularly more amenable to research methods. So you've got to think about the methodologies you can use, and actually some of the other senses sometimes are harder to work with, right? So with something like vision, you can use a very static image on a screen to study vision. If you wanted to study sound or something like touch, it's much more dynamic. You're dealing with something that is much more harder to sometimes control and manipulate in a lab. So I think there's methodological components, and as I said, with regards to the affective side of things, this idea about how does a pleasurable touch feel good, and what are the impacts on that? Some of that, I think, was also driven by the fact it wasn't really until the 1990s that we became aware that in our skin, we have receptors that are specifically more likely to respond to things like slow, gentle strokes from somebody else. So that kind of calming, soothing touch. And I think with that almost kind of giving that biological underpinning to that type of experience, suddenly more science started to then dig into it. So sometimes you need those types of validations to drive a field forward. And I think that did make a big difference, certainly when those studies came out in the 1990s.
Very good points, because that's something I'm very, very curious about also in my research, actually.